Hello and welcome back to the channel and to my second quilt trunk show. I have a few things that I'd like to share with you today. Some that I made myself and others that were given to me as gifts or that I purchased. But either way, I hope it helps you to get ideas for gift giving. First is a quilt that my husband and I bought at an auction when we were expecting our first baby, our son. It measures 39 inches by 47 inches. The blue rectangles are 2.5 by 4 inches, not counting seam allowance. The pink squares are 2.5 inches square, not counting seam allowance. And the squares that have the quilted heart in the middle are 4 inches square, also not counting seam allowance. The backing was like a brushed nylon or a really soft tricot, and it has worn with age. It's 30 years old, and the fuzziness has been rubbed off in spots. It's a little bare, but the front has held up perfectly. This quilt I bought as a panel. It was already quilted with the backing on it, so all I did was finish off the edges. But this is a really good option if you're hard-pressed for time or you want to make a quilt but you don't have the time to put into piecing one, or you've never pieced a quilt before but you still would like to make a quilt for somebody. This is a really good option. It's 33 inches by 41 inches. And I think that the little Noah's Ark design is just so charming. This quilt was given to me when my daughter was born, so it's 27 years old. It's made of 2 lengths of flannel fabric. It's 35.5 by 42 inches. And it was just machine quilted with vertical stitching about 3 to 4 inches apart. This is also a very quick way to make a quilt. This is a wall hanging that I made for the Thanksgiving holiday season. It measures 25 by 26 inches. The thankful writing, turkey body and head, legs, and pumpkins are all made out of fabric with a fusible webbing. The fusible webbing is ironed onto the fabric, and then those pieces are cut out, and then paper is pulled off and then ironed onto the background fabric. The feathers are the same pattern that you would use for a Dresden plate quilt pattern, and they are top stitched with a blanket stitch on my machine. After making the large turkey wall hanging, I decided that I wanted to make a smaller mini turkey and make 3 panels into a table runner. I also wanted to make 2 smaller wall hangings to give away to friends and family. The smaller wall hangings measure 12.5 by 14.5 inches. One has binding that I attach to it. The other one uses the backing fabric as the binding. It is brought over to the front, rolled over, and then stitched on by machine. The table runner measures 16 by 45 inches. I'll leave the links to the videos I made of the large and small wall hangings, as well as the table runner and the original video that Jenny Doan of the Missouri Star Quilt Company did of this wall hanging, in the description box. This is a Quilt As You Go without sashing quilt that I made in the square in a square pattern. I made this as a baby quilt for my niece's son. If you're not familiar with Quilt As You Go quilts, here's a quick synopsis. You cut out the squares of batting and the back part, the back fabric, to the measurement that you want, and then you cut out your design pieces for the front, and then when you sew your design together, you are sewing it also to the backing and the batting, eliminating the process of going back and quilting the quilt. It's made up of 20 blocks, and completed it measures 40 inches by 50 inches with a binding of 2 1/4 inches width. And yes, I do have a video showing the complete process of this one. I'll leave the link for you in the description box. This lap or toddler quilt I just recently made. I had made the quilt top 4 years prior out of leftover fabric, leftover flannel that I had from other projects. And I found this beautiful red and black tartan plaid flannel on sale at Joann's to use for the backing. It has a 4-inch border of gray flannel. It's tied with embroidery floss, and I used an embroidery hoop to tie it. I left the backing 1 1/2 inches larger than the top and used the excess material as the binding and stitched it down by machine. I call it the Scrappy tied quilt, and I'll leave the link to the video that I made in the description box. This is a little 5x7 wall hanging, Americana wall hanging that I made using Wonder Under. I hand stitched a blanket stitch around the flag and did a running stitch through the binding, but you could use a sewing machine to stitch those items if you wanted to. In my first trunk show, I showed the witch's feet wall hanging. In this trunk show, I'm showing the witch's feet pattern, but I made it into a pillow cover to go over my pillows that I have on my sofa. Finished, it measures 17 inches by 17 1/2 inches. This is a flannel quilt that was purchased at a church bazaar about 35 years ago. It measures 42 inches in width and 69 inches in length. It's a yarn tied quilt, and instead of having a binding on it, it was finished off with a decorative stitch, scallop stitch, and then trimmed close to the stitching with rounded corners. For as old as it is, it has held up really well, and it's still very soft and comfy. I think that it's just a really great example of what you can do if you want to make a quilt and don't want a piece of top and have 2 pieces of fabric that you really love. This next project was a set of 4 placemats that I did in a Quilt As You Go pattern. They measure 13 inches by 18 inches and are made of 2 1/2 inch strips that I made into a braided design. The binding was made out of 2 1/2 inch strips. I'll leave the link to the video I made on this in the description box as well. This quilt was given to me as a quilt top only, and it was made by my grandmother and great-grandmother. It probably sat for 40 years in a trunk, and then before I got married, I asked somebody I knew that loved to quilt if they would put a backing on it and quilt it for me. She also added a border of 4 different fabrics. So the quilt top is probably 70 years old, and the border, binding, and backing are 30 years old. It measures 84 inches by 105 inches. And I just love it. Thanks for letting me share some of my favorite quilts. And I hope that this gave you some gift-giving ideas. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.